Welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I'm Anthony, your host. We're back after a 2-month hiatus. I had naively thought back in mid-August that I could, relax and take a sort of vacation and that sort of thing, but it didn't quite work out. The administrative business never let up. In fact, transitioning to a semi-COVID situation in the university proved to be more labor-intensive than the full COVID lockdown of last year. So a lot of paperwork. At the same time, I was co-authoring a new book with Marian Cruz on the late Roman field armies, and I hope to have the chance to talk to you about that in the future. We started pulling on some threads and realized that the entire institutional history of the late Roman field armies, especially in the East, had to be rewritten. And so we did that. It's pretty technical work, but very interesting. Anyway, hopefully I'll tell you about that later on. In the meantime, I did continue to record episodes, so we have a very interesting list of speakers coming up in the next few weeks. I'm also trying to reach out to more European colleagues and include them increasingly more into the podcast. That sometimes involves some scheduling problems because the time differences and, European things like they commute on trains and other exotic things like that. But overall, some great stuff to look forward to. So let's dive right in. Back in the 20th century, it was fairly common to read that one of the greatest achievements of Byzantine civilization was to spread Christianity to, quote, the Slavs. This was back when we believed that the Byzantines had much of an interest in, missionary work and spreading Christianity and so forth, which we now know they kind of really didn't that much. But the question about Slavic Christianity in particular was wrapped up, as you might imagine, in all kinds of modern, nationalist narratives, or just national narratives, that were also wrapped up in the creation of Slavic identity and Eastern Orthodox Christianity, especially Slavic Christianity. And as many of you know, this narrative has been focused on these two brothers, Constantine and Methodius. Constantine, who took the monastic name Cyril later on, so he's sometimes known as Constantine-Cyril or Cyril and Methodius. These were some 9th century Byzantine scholars from Thessaloniki who were part of the extended Byzantine court and were sent to Moravia, and their journeys took them to other places as well in order to promote the cause of Christianization when neighboring rulers asked Constantinople for some help in converting their realms to Christianity, organizing their church, and also creating a Christian literature in Slavic. So Constantine-Cyril was instrumental in creating the early version of what would later become the Slavonic alphabet for writing mostly Christian Slavic literature. In modern narratives, these two brothers they're lionized, literally canonized. They're saints. They are talismanic and emblematic figures for what we might broadly call sort of Slavic Orthodox identity. Their names are put in the names of institutions and journals, and they're celebrated, and there are statues of them in public squares and so forth. Now, as today's episode is going to take a somewhat skeptical look at our sources for their work and the way those sources are used. Let me just first say, for the record, that these two brothers, they absolutely were real. They absolutely did most of the things that we think that they did. And if you want to find personalities to symbolize the broad cultural transformation that happened, between Moravia and Bulgaria, and in a more extended sense between Rome and Constantinople in the 9th century, they will do nicely. However, in historical analysis, we should do more than be looking for symbols. And so I will note 3 things in connection with this. First, this was an experience I still remember. So this was late in my grad school years. I was having a conversation with a friend, Stefanos Efthymiadis, who casually pointed out to me that, they're not really mentioned in Byzantine sources. Like Byzantine sources are apparently not aware of any of the development that is grouped today under the rubric of the conversion of the Slavs, the invention of the Slavonic alphabet, and all of that. It didn't really interest them that much, and they weren't really aware of who Constantine and Methodius were. The second point is the topic of today's conversation, which is that this entire meta-narrative about the creation of Slavonic Christianity and the sort of Christian ratification of Slavic national identities, that whole thing, inflected as it was in the 20th century by the politics of the Cold War, it ultimately rests on a couple of sources. And these are two lives, a life of Constantine and a life of Methodius. The first one survives in Slavonic, was very possibly written in Greek originally, but also possibly not in the Byzantine Empire. The second one of Methodius in Latin. And these texts, if you look at them closely, don't quite seem to be about that narrative. They seem to be about other things. And if you take the texts outside of the modern context in which they are often used and read and deployed, and say, okay, what is this text trying to tell me? What are its interests? They turn out to be quite different. Not contradictory to the modern story, as just different. And they seem to have been pressed into service for lack of better sources that sort of trumpet the narrative that modern scholars have wanted to find. My guest today is Mirela Ivanova, University of Sheffield in the UK, and she has written two excellent articles looking at these sources and what their politics seem to be in connection with the events of their time, and also what other kinds of controversies and agendas were they part of that have kind of fallen by the wayside because of our overriding focus on the creation of Slavonic Christianity and the like. I will note one other aspect of the general problem before we head straight into the discussion, which is that the creation of a Christian church and a literature in the sort of Slavonic-speaking lands was the work of very many people, thousands of active participants, in a very complicated political scene. You have a number of states, sort of kings with competing agendas, and you have the Franks and the papacy and Constantinople all involved in separate ways, often competing with each other. And it was really, really messy. Trying to sort out the details of what happened is very complicated. And this is another sense in which sort of the fixation on Cyril and Methodius is very reductive. There were many people involved in this process with different agendas, and it's not clear that what resulted in the end, which we eventually recognize as like Slavonic Orthodox Christianity, was what most of those agents were working toward. Different groups had different agendas, and it kind of worked out this way. And Mirella also talks about these aspects in her studies as well. They don't come up so much in our discussion. Anyway, I've spoken for too long already, so without any further delay, here's my conversation with Mirela Ivanova. Hello, Mirela. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So you've been writing some very interesting things about Cyril/Constantine and Methodius, his brother, and the mission to the Slavs, and the invention of the Cyrillic alphabet. And I have to say, I really like your work. You are explaining some things that were kind of nagging at me every time I read about this tradition in the scholarship and contrasted it to the sources, but I had never quite put my finger on the problem the way you articulate it. So I really want to present this to people because it's a major topic. I mean, it's pretty huge. If you can ask some people, like, what are the top 5 things of Byzantine civilization, and they'll say the conversion of the Slavs and the invention of the Cyrillic alphabet. So Let's get a little bit into the sources here and see what's going on, because it's a much more sort of interesting, complicated story that's kind of been corralled into these modern narratives. But we'll get to that. So why don't we start by just give us a bit of the general background of the invention of the Cyrillic alphabet, just so that our audience knows where and when we're situated.
Yeah, absolutely. So over the course of the 9th century begins this kind of long and tedious process of the conversion of the Slavs, let's say. And this is going on in a number of different places, and it's being sort of directed by Byzantium on the one hand, and by the sort of papacy and East Frankish Empire on the other. And the people that we're talking about are occupying kind of the territories of the modern-day Czech and Slovak republics, Hungary, a little bit of Austria, and then all of the Balkans. So in particular, kind of Bulgaria, Macedonia, and Serbia, Croatia. And so over the course of the 9th century, political leaders in these regions reach out to either Byzantium or Rome to begin their processes of official conversion, and then sort of the much longer process of Christianization. In about the 860s in particular, there is a real uptick of interest. And almost simultaneously, Boris, the ruler of Bulgaria at the time, approaches the papacy and the Frankish Empire for missionaries in about 863, 864. And at almost the same time, about 861 to 864, the ruler of Moravia, who's called Rastislav, and Moravia's in the modern day sort of Czech-Slovak Republic region, reaches out to the Byzantine Emperor Michael. So this sort of entangled moment of conversion interest is what sets the scene for Cyril and Methodius' mission and the invention of the alphabet.
Right. So tell us a little bit about them and how this alphabet came into being and how it spread, just very generally.
Yeah, well, of course, I mean, the caveat here is that part of my research is about trying to nuance a little bit the traditional narrative of the spread of this alphabet and its invention. But the conventional story goes that Cyril and Methodius, and Cyril in particular, are what we could probably best describe today as kind of Christian diplomats for the Byzantine regime. In that Cyril in particular, we know, is sent out on a number of missions by the Emperor Michael to both the Arab court and then later the Khazar court, which is in Central Asia on the kind of north of the Caspian Sea. And what he does there is a bit peculiar. I mean, he sort of disputes with Muslims and Jewish scholars. It's not clear that he achieves very much in doing this, which is why I don't call him necessarily a missionary, but a kind of Christian diplomat, because he's definitely there to make his case, but oftentimes it's not clear that very many people convert there and then. And we certainly know historically that they didn't. So that's what he's been up to up until the point when he goes back to Constantinople and is sent on his final mission in his kind of life, which is the mission to the Slavs. So that's kind of his background. The other important part of his background is not so much his professional career as his education. Both Cyril and Methodius come from modern-day Thessaloniki in Greece, and Cyril in particular seems to move to Constantinople at quite an early age to undertake a kind of traditional Byzantine philosophical education. So moving beyond just kind of grammar and rhetoric, he goes on to study kind of philosophy proper, supposedly with the quite eminent Byzantine intellectual figure Photius, who later becomes a controversial patriarch, of course. So Cyril's kind of got the accolades of the educational elite of Byzantium, and then is sent on these kind of quite high-profile missions before he goes to the Slavs. Methodius' story is a little bit more questionable, because the main source for it, his life, is a little bit more unreliable in my opinion, at least. But he also seems to spend some time in Thessaloniki, and then eventually seems to essentially become a monk. His eventual involvement in the mission to the Slavs is a matter of dispute. But at some point he ends up over in Central Europe as well, and is appointed bishop of Moravia and Pannonia by the Pope himself. So his legitimizing authority ends up being the papacy rather than the emperor.
So the standard narrative is that Cyril, who speaks both Greek and Slavonic, invents a early version of what later became the Cyrillic alphabet named after him, and that this eventually caught on more, not in the lands that he was sent to, but in Bulgaria, and spread from there presumably to the north and so forth. So we have a situation where some Slavic languages are written in that alphabet, and ultimately, and some are not. What's the broad distinction there between Slavic languages that use the Cyrillic alphabet and those that don't? And I mean, obviously, this is a very long development and political choices made along this step, every step of the way. But is there some kind of general pattern to that distribution?
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it's one of the quite interesting tensions between the medieval sources about Slavonic, which tend to make the case that it's just impossible to write down the Slavonic languages without a Slavonic alphabet. And it's particularly fun to sort of read a defense of these texts in Czech, which is written in the Latin alphabet. And so there is definitely a kind of something interesting has happened after the invention of the alphabet. And the way that scholars tend to talk about this is that it's a product of kind of confessional identity. So the alphabets become attached to particular kinds of confessionalizations. So the two groups of Slavs, so to say, in the simplest terms, of Slavia Orthodoxa, which is Orthodox Slavs that held on to the Cyrillic alphabet, and the Catholic Slavia, which are the Poles, the sort of Croats, and then the Czechs and the Slovaks. There are interesting developments there. I mean, what's happening in Serbia, for example, where they use both the Latin and the Cyrillic alphabet in a largely Orthodox country, is more a development of the kind of ubiquitization of the Latin script in general. And teenagers in Macedonia and Russia can write their languages in the Latin script, and so forth. But yeah, so that's the confessional story of the spread of the alphabet. There is a sort of side story to the spread of the alphabet, which is a much more political one, and that's to do with Russian expansion in Central Asia. I mean, somewhere between sort of 600, it's unclear, but somewhere around 600 million people use the Slavonic, the Cyrillic alphabet. And after Russia, the second largest populated country that uses it is Kazakhstan. So in terms of figures, a lot of Cyrillic is actually now being being used, is not being used in Europe at all. But again, in Central Asia, there's been movements to kind of abandon it as well for various anti-Slavic political reasons. So the alphabet's doing really different things in different parts of the world, and it's easy to think of it as a solely East European phenomenon, but it's definitely a much more kind of global thing.
Okay, so looking more broadly, this narrative of the invention of the alphabet, the Cyrillic one in particular, has in some corners of the scholarly world, but also in a lot of popular publications, it's presented, with cosmic significance. Like this is some kind of huge revolution in history, and some kind of rupture or new beginning or anything like that. So what are the modern narratives or interests that have given rise to those kinds of claims?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and you're absolutely right. At the heart of every modern nation's investment in the Slavonic alphabet is the belief that its invention was something really remarkable and foundational. The way that these narratives actually manifest themselves totally depends on what relationship each country has to what we discussed earlier, this kind of the movement from the alphabet from the Byzantine court to Central Europe, and then through the kind of disciples of Cyril and Methodius to Bulgaria, and eventually to what we now call Russia. So each country in each region has invested in sort of different aspects of that story, and in particular, some have invested in, this is where tension comes in different sources' readings of those stories. So there's plenty of dispute about the exact order of travel of Cyril and Methodius in Central Europe, whether they go to Pannonia first or whether they go to Rome before they go to Pannonia. And this seems incredibly unimportant until you're Slovenia and you think you are Pannonia, and it's actually really important whether they came to you under Byzantine rule or whether they came to you under papal and the papal sort of jurisdiction. So in short, I mean, the foundational principle is that Cyril and Methodius are the apostles to the Slavs, and they in some sense, there's a sense that they liberated the Slavs from the yoke of using foreign alphabets. But in essence, what's happened is that the Slavonic alphabet has enabled the birth of Slavonic culture, is what people think. And so the Slavonic alphabet is kind of really constitutive of the Slavonic peoples having political autonomy and having a distinct identity in the world. And you really do see this in the sort of the way that medieval sources talk about this. There's this real sense that the development of the alphabet is kind of central to the development of those states, of their independence, of their kind of sense of self. And that, I think, is very much still the case, sort of left, right, and center. So that's why it's seen as so kind of generative and so kind of groundbreaking. But as you say, the reality is actually that it's not that unusual to invent an alphabet. So something very particular has happened here, you know.
Yes, I think that Slavonic culture and all of its regional variation and diversity would still have survived.
Yeah, probably. Right? Yeah. No, absolutely.
And you can simply point to those countries that use the Latin alphabet. They have their perfectly own local cultures that aren't right. And the same goes with the claim that it was this alphabet that sort of liberated Slavonic culture or enabled modern national identities or all of this. It's a surprisingly small technical fix that has resulted in allegedly some astonishing historical consequences downstream. And I'm not sure that anyway, as we'll get into in a moment, it was neither unprecedented nor I think that remarkable a historical transformation. But it is important to recognize that there's a lot of modern narrative and even identities and national narratives that have been piled up on top of these events in the 9th century, and in particular on a couple of texts.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the kind of there's a real kind of cognitive dissonance that happens when, as a scholar, and in particular, so you know, I was born in Bulgaria in the 5th grade. At the end of the 1st grade, when you learn to write, every Bulgarian child has a picture taken on the 24th of May, which is the day of the Slavonic alphabet, because you've just become literate, of course. And I have this picture of me at a desk that, you know, they brought the professional photographer in, and it's just got a little sign on the top of the desk, and it says, "Mother, I am now literate," which is a very strange invocation. But behind me is a picture of Cyril and Methodius, and every child in my class, every class in my school, every school in Bulgaria does this. Everybody has that picture, and so when you've grown up to some degree, obviously I moved to the UK when I was still quite young, and at the time that was the most normal thing in the world. But then I'd rediscovered the alphabet when I was sort of 21, starting to be a graduate student, and went to an event about it that was led by some Bulgarians, and I just thought, this is very strange, actually. And you go back and you read the sources, and there is this real cognitive dissonance between what you find there and what you've come to believe, or the sheer prevalence of this phenomenon in Eastern Europe. I mean, I could give you an endless list of the sort of unlikely appearances of Cyril Methodius, from like the Constitution of the Slovak Republic through to like passport pages, through to like random statues in the middle of nowhere in like Siberia. Like everywhere you go, like schools are named after them, streets, whatever. Like schools in Eastern Europe are often named after medieval saints rather than slightly more generic saints, I guess. So they're sort of, their prevalence is quite extraordinary. And then, as you say, you go back to the sources and you're like, we're working with very little here. And part of what I was trying to do is to say, okay, well, what if we only said what is there, or what if we tried to find what we might be able to say if we kind of unpick those layers of assumption upon assumption.
Sure. Yeah, and I want to talk about those sources in detail in a moment. But I have to share a similar story that I have when I learned to write. So the funny thing is, I grew up in Greece, right? But I couldn't speak Greek until I went to kindergarten, because I was raised by my mother, who's American, and she put me in this Greek kindergarten and said, "Look, but he doesn't speak any Greek, and don't worry about it; he'll catch up." And I did. but I learned to write in Greek first. And then this one summer, my mom, we went back to the States to see grandparents and all that. I could only write in Greek. I was very young. I don't remember how young. And my mother put me in I think it was the Philadelphia Natural History Museum. They had like some summer thing for kids, basically babysitting, but with some sort of, pedagogical mission sort of painted on top. And they said, okay, why don't we all write our names on this little bunny that you hang from your neck? And I wrote it. I was embarrassed because I knew that they wouldn't know what an omega is or whatever, but I wrote it in Greek, and the kids laughed. I'm like, he doesn't know how to write yet. He doesn't know how to write. Like, no, I know how to write. It's just a different language. Anyway. Okay. So the key text, right? The crown jewel in the narrative is the life of Cyril Constantine, which survives in Slavonic, though you believe, I think rightly, that it's based on a Greek original. And so let's talk a little bit about this text. It's a hagiographical text that tells the life of the central figure in the drama. And so I have reasons to be skeptical of it. I mean, but in a particular way, and I'll explain how later. But why don't you tell us first, like, how this narrative has been used for the most part in modern retellings, and what you find in the story when you look at it independently of those retellings.
Yeah, so the general reading of Constantine-Cyril is that he was a sort of renegade that went against the norms of Byzantine culture by choosing to invent an alphabet for the Slavs, and that he was therefore sort of very sympathetic to the Slavs in a way that led him to almost break with his own kind of political and ethnic commitment. And this is part of a more general reading of the Byzantine Empire across kind of scholarship in Slavonic as largely sort of condescending towards all other culture, which there's some truth in, but as deeply kind of uninterested in other cultures and deeply kind of condescending toward them. So in Constantine-Cyril, the scholarship has tended to find a kind of unlikely hero who over the course of the Middle Ages grows increasingly more and more stripped of his Byzantine identity. Scholars are not very interested in that. They're much more interested in what he does, which is invent this alphabet. And so his life is often seen as a kind of defense of that act, and in particular as a defense of his sympathies towards the Slavs. The thing I found most striking when I read the text is just how little the text is concerned with the invention of the alphabet.
Right.
In general. I mean, as I said earlier, the text is about his kind of very elite education, and the text is overwhelmingly about his professional career as a Christian diplomat. And the real centerpiece of the text, if we take the crude view that whatever it is that somebody talks most about is the thing that's most important to them, which may not be completely true, but it certainly points us in the right direction. The invention of the alphabet and the whole mission to Christianize Moravia take up about 2 pages of the text, which is roughly 20 pages in A4 edition. The mission to the Khazars in the Caspian Sea, where Cyril performs a long disputation with Jewish scholars and with some scholars who know about Islam, is 7 pages long. So my reading of this text was that this was a text that was obsessed with Constantine-Cyril, for sure, and with his intellectual superiority, absolutely. But that this was not really a text that cared that much about the Slavic people. Like, the text liked that Cyril invented this alphabet, and definitely the author of the text is very proud that Cyril did so, and that he did so at the behest of the Emperor Michael, and that he did so with the approval of the papacy. But in general, over 50% of the text is quotes of disputations Cyril has with other people. and Cyril doesn't really dispute with anybody, with any of the Slavs,
Mm-hmm.
who are just happy, just delighted that he's there. And the Slavs end up kind of quite marginal and quite caricatured in the story. And so basically my takeaway from this was, if you're really looking for a national hero, this is a terrible place to look. This man is not a good one. And so there is this kind of, so I found this very, very strange distance between the character I remember from my childhood, who was the apostle to my people,
Yeah.
and then here we are, and it looks like just your average Byzantine saint going about his Byzantine business.
Yes. So I particularly like the way that you picked apart the structure of the text, and so you found that there's this educational background, and it leads to a disputation. And this happens 3 times, or if not a disputation, what you called a religious diplomacy mission or something like this, right? And so it's very structured to be about the trajectory of Constantine's life, and not about, say, his experiences in, either converting the Slavs or interacting with them in any way. Like, you don't have little episodes where he disputes with and confounds, local representatives of the pre-Christian religions and things like this, right? So my skepticism about this text is, so it's not about like, sure, Constantine was real and he did more or less some of these things. It's that the text has been written up afterwards by someone to make him look, I think, way more important than he was. And it does so by using specific techniques, narrative techniques that you find in other Byzantine, let's, for lack of a better word, loosely call them biographies. So one of them is it's the name dropping.
Yeah,
endless
absolutely.
name dropping. It's like, that he went to Constantinople and he met all the important people and they all knew him and their names are mentioned and they loved him and right? And it's like you're writing a story about somebody who lived in the 80s, right? And this person, he went to the White House and he was greeted by the president, but he also met with Michael Jackson and was educated by Noam Chomsky. And it's too much. For a person who's never mentioned in Byzantine texts, okay, maybe there's this letter by Photius to him, one out of, I don't know how many hundreds, maybe. And he's not remembered afterwards. And that juxtaposition always makes me feel like, okay, there's a bit of desperation in this text to slot this guy into all the important events and meeting with all the important people. And the structure is also very formulaic. And there are many saints' lives in the tradition before it that are precisely this, the learned Christian saint who goes out to foreign lands and disputes either with the king or with the king's, priests or, whatever. And that's very formulaic. Like, they're texts that lay out exactly how that should be done. And at every step, his achievements are exaggerated all the time, right? Like, he frees, 200 Byzantine prisoners from the Khazars, and he prevents them from attacking the empire, even though they're at peace. I mean, it's too much.
Well, and most importantly, he supposedly gets the Khazar chieftain to promise to convert very soon.
Right.
Even though we know that at exactly that moment in time, the Byzantine mission to convert the Khazars failed.
Yes.
And they did not convert. So no, absolutely. I think the thing that's quite interesting about Cyril is that, as you say, he isn't in any of the, we don't really have him recorded in any Byzantine sources, but he clearly successfully manages to bamboozle his way into the Roman elite. And that's the thing that's quite interesting. And so the other kind of name dropping that you have in the text is much later on, where he sort of arrives at Rome and the Pope welcomes him. And then the Pope gets some of his kind of high dignitaries to sort of, I think it's to consecrate some Slavonic speaking priests. And the people that are listed that are kind of present at the death of Cyril and at this kind of celebration of him, they're quite major characters in it's Anastasius the librarian, and there's also somebody who later becomes a bishop, the Pope, sorry, who later becomes a pope in the 890s. So there's this real sense that in and eventually, and we know that Cyril gets buried in the cathedral, in the Basilica of St. Clement in Rome, where his relics are kept for a very long time. And we do have some 11th century frescoes of him bringing the relics of Pope Clement to Rome, and he's got a halo over his head. So we know that in one place he definitely ended up being remembered a saint. He managed to somehow successfully successfully bamboozle this world into thinking that he really is in fact important, or if not him, then his sort of community, his successors, sort of persuaded the papacy to that end. And so I think what you say about the kind of the boasting of his significance in the Byzantine world makes quite a lot of sense if you're his successor at Rome, where you've persuaded everybody that this guy really is the real deal, who's come from the East, and he's really been, people love him there, you know. I think that definitely checks out with I think the most likely context of this text being written, which is in Greek but in Rome.
Yes. You know the trope of big in Japan?
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. So this is it's a B-list Byzantine, intellectual. He's traveled. He's just a religious figure, but he's really big in Rome.
Exactly.
Because for one thing, like, he knows Greek, check, and he also knows Slavic language, so check. And so, like, super important. And yeah, it's entirely possible that the text is the product of this sort of circles of his followers, maybe in Rome, that are trying to make him seem very, very important. And there was a Slavic stuff too. Like that's
and that helps as well, right? That's part and parcel of how amazing he is. But the thing that's definitely true when you compare this text to other Byzantine kind of hagiographies about really learned men, like Patriarch Nicephorus, for example, who is a classic instance of that, because his life is full of kind of logical textbooks, and he also has a series of disputes with the Emperor Leo on iconoclasm. And when you look at the content, the intellectual content of that life, it's really sophisticated. Whereas when you look at the actual debates that Cyril is having, it's quite derivative. Right? The actual content of the text is striving to be something kind of more intellectually sophisticated than it can deliver, I think. And it's sophisticated in its kind of structure, but the actual materials that are being utilized are fairly derivative, I think.
Now, Constantine does make a very important statement about the languages that can be used in worship. This is in the text, and this is, I think, quite rightly a very important statement. And it occurs in the context of the debates, right, over which languages are appropriate for use in Christian worship. So can you tell us a little bit about that statement and its importance, and then we can talk about some of the historical background? Because, by the way, I think he's right, like, in what he says. He's right. So who does he say this to?
Yeah. So this is another kind of reason why this text is perhaps not a good source for the uniqueness and the significance of the invention of Slavonic. And it is that in a disputation with some Venetian priests, so the life is very pro-papacy, but it's very happy to sacrifice some Latin priests in sort of doing so. And so Constantine is having a debate about how many holy languages there are towards the end of the text, after he's invented the Slavonic alphabet. And the Latins say, well, of course, there's only Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, because those were the languages inscribed on the cross of Christ, which is a kind of strange semi-apocryphal sort of memory. And Constantine says to them, well, actually, that's not true. And the quote in particular from the text is, we know peoples who have knowledge of books and praise God, and each do it in their own language. And it is known to us that these are, and then he goes on to list, the Armenians, the Persians, the Abkhazians, the Georgians, the Sogdian Goths, the Avars, the Turks, the Khazars, the Arabs, the Egyptians, and many others. So in this, Constantine himself is saying, the Slavs aren't that special. The Slavs are just like all these other people. And all I've done is given them what all these other people already have. I'm not doing something remarkable here. I'm just doing the thing that that loads of people have done before. And that's really important, because it is a point of conflict in East-West theology, or certainly develops to be one. Especially by the time of the Reformation, there is this very, very real sense that a real caricature of the Latin, of the papacy and the Catholic Church, that they are down on vernacular languages, and they become these bastions of the idea that Mass has got to be in Latin and it's got to be in a kind of holy or a sacred language. It's not really clear how much that's the case in the 9th century papacy. So there is a little bit of caricaturing going on there. But it's definitely the case that when you look at the Eastern Mediterranean, there's no sense that there is such a thing as a finite number of holy languages. And the evidence very much points to the contrary. So the fact that the fact that the biographer has written this does suggest that it's a rare moment where the biographer goes, it's not that important. It's not that special what Cyril's done. Although my point here is to kind of elevate this person in all ways. It's that the mask sort of slips a bit, and he goes, well, actually, this is quite a common practice.
Yes, and he would have known. I mean, the Byzantines were positioned on the edge of, the whole, Eastern world, which was full of Christians. And, this is sometimes forgotten by historians of Christianity, that at this time, probably the majority of Christians in the world are living under Muslim rule, and are using like Syriac or Arabic or Coptic. So these are millions and millions of people are using those languages in far greater numbers than are using Latin, or probably even Greek. And so, we got to keep that in mind. And he mentions some even more obscure groups. I mean, Sogdians, I'm not even sure what the Sogdians are using at this time. But this is what always struck me as interesting about this claim. And what to me is the odd way in which it's been repositioned as the beginning of a process, right? It's a beginning of a process that leads to modern national cultures and so forth. Whereas I see it as the end. Like, I see a process of, the early Christian world generating scripts for local use already, from the Coptic, late 3rd century, Gothic, mid-4th, Armenian, mid-5th. Like, there's this whole process of these scripts being invented, at least like Coptic and Gothic, I think, and Coptic is basically Greek. It's closer to Greek than the Cyrillic is, but I think Gothic also was based on Greek spelling and orthography, and on and on and on. And for me, the Cyrillic alphabet is like the last.
Yeah.
Well, not the last, but among the last in that phase of the chain, and so. Not belated, certainly, but in its natural time, the same process happens there. So I never thought, wow, well, this is so extraordinary. It's a new beginning for history or something. It's just one among many that had come before.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely something there. Like I remember kind of struggling with this idea as well, that at one point, I was interested in the Slavonic script as the last invented alphabet. I moved away from that because there are alphabets that are invented afterwards, of course.
Sure.
But in general, I think an interesting way of looking at the Slavs in the sort of region of the Balkans, with respect to the wider processes of the transformation of the ancient world, is to think of this region of Central and Southeastern Europe, and also for the Kievan Rus, as essentially going through late antiquity a bit late.
Right. Yes.
Yes. And there's a lot more to learn. There's a lot more fruitful comparison to be made between the conversion of the Slavs and the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons than there is to be made between the conversions of the Slavs and the sort of late medieval conversion processes anywhere else. And so I think that there's something last minute, there's something a little bit late in that, and it does make them the kind of the last inheritors of that process. And part of that is for the reason that the Germanic, when the barbarians came and sort of when the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths and so on came, and then started essentially undergoing these same processes of sedentarization, Christianization, and then adopting literacy, often with at the same time as religion. These processes just start a little bit later in the Balkans, which in the 7th century in particular, and in the 6th century certainly, the Balkans seem to be largely unoccupied. So there's a kind of there's a little chronographical gap, but I definitely think it's worth putting these together. There is, however, I don't know if you know about Saint Stephen of Perm, who is my personal favorite saint, who is he's a sort of 14th, 15th century Rus, well, I guess by this point, early Muscovite saint, who tries in the tradition of Cyril and Methodius to convert the Permians, who are people in the kind of Altaic region. And he kind of goes out there and a life of his is written, and the life is infused with Cyril Methodian imagery. It says, like he was better than Cyril Methodius because he was only one, but they were two, and all of this sort of stuff. And he comes up with a language for the Permian people. But over the course of it, the text is riddled with like a lot more resistance. Like they set his hair on fire and they like burn down his hut. And the people are just much less happy about him being there. So there's much more of a sense that a sense of the resistance, which we never get in the Slavonic and the earlier lives. And eventually he just gets sent home. But he claimed, the life claims he got to convert a few people by inventing them an alphabet. And the alphabet does survive, but what actually happens to it is over the course of the 16th century, the Russian intelligentsia start using it to write coded messages, and that's the only sort of and that's his kind of legacy. But it does make me wonder. The reason I like that story is because, how many unwritten stories are there of men who tried to invent an alphabet and it never got anywhere, and I think that there's always an element of chance when you read the life of Cyril. Someone's betting that this is going to come good, but if it comes good, the life maybe survives, and if it doesn't come good, the life kind of disappears. To go back to exceptionality versus unexceptionality, I'm sure there's loads of untold stories of failed attempts to get alphabets off the ground.
Yeah, and there's some inventions that just kind of appear. We don't know who was behind them, like Coptic. Obviously, this came out of some monasteries in Egypt that were, trying to, and again, the invention of Coptic for a long time was presented as this kind of resistance to Hellenism.
Yeah. The resistance narratives are really interesting. The sense that alphabet choice is kind of ethnic.
Yeah.
Is ethnic boundary keeping.
Which, in the case of Coptic, is completely impossible. But for a number of reasons, we don't need to get into it. But the precedents for the life of Constantine would be, like Mesrop Mashtots and the Armenian tradition, and Ulfilas in the Gothic tradition, whom we don't know much about because he was an Arian, like just simply because of confessional politics.
Yeah.
And otherwise, there would have been and he was operating in exactly the same geographical region, right? That whole kind of Pannonia, Balkan area.
World.
Going to Constantinople for conferences and anyway. So if the life of Constantine is not the place where we get like the narrative, like this is the apostle to the Slavs, this is what his life was about, this is the main contribution. So how does that story come into being, and what are the politics behind that? It came about pretty soon, right?
Yeah, so it really begins to come about. Like I think probably the closest to the modern story that we have in the Slavonic sources appears by the end of the 10th century, by sort of within 100 years of Cyril's death, and the first instantiation of that definitely, and in particular this idea that Cyril and Methodius are brothers who are totally devoted to their one mission, and their mission has always been and only been the conversion of the Slavs. We get that already in the life of Methodius, which is a really interesting text. So the life of Methodius is written sometime after 885, roughly, which is about 16 years after the death of Cyril. So in between sort of 869 and 885, the life of Cyril must have been written whilst Methodius was still alive. And then we have the life of Methodius, which clearly draws on the life of Cyril, but completely reinterprets it. And I think in some ways, like of all the stuff that I've done working on this, like this is probably the most disruptive thing that I say, or probably like the most kind of innovative thing that I say, which is that actually, if you read the life of Methodius very closely, it's not what everybody has always said it was, which is a continuation of the life of Cyril, or a kind of celebration of Cyril, and that it's very much like ideologically in the spirit of the life of Cyril, and it just confirms this coherent story of the commitment of Cyril and Methodius to the Slavs. But it's actually a real radical departure from what we have in the life of Cyril, from its values and from its kind of ideological commitments, and from what it thinks sanctity is and what it thinks the alphabet is about. And what we have in the life of Methodius is instead this kind of incredibly abbreviated account of Cyril and Methodius's lives, in which Methodius is just really aggressively inserted into events from the life of Cyril that in the life of Cyril he simply is not present for, including the invention of the alphabet, where we have no sense that he is on that mission until Cyril dies at the end of his life, and he appears after his death to kind of take his body home. There's this kind of very, very clear choice to insert Methodius in all of these moments. But at the same time as doing that, so what we get from the life of Methodius is essentially the story that I've heard as a kid, which is Cyril and Methodius were apostles to the Slavs. They were two brothers that from their birth had one mission, and that was to enlighten the Slavs. But the thing that's funny about the life of Methodius, and the reason why it also doesn't work as the ultimate source of kind of the modern narrative, is that the life of Methodius is obsessed with the papacy. It's not a Greek text at all. It's I would say barely an Orthodox text. It's interested in appeasing the papacy to continue to kind of support the mission of Methodius, and its rhetoric is kind of, it's not papal supremacy just yet, but it's very much papal primacy. The emperor, the patriarch, they seem very far away. No one's being name dropped anymore from the Byzantine world. There's no more names. They don't even name the emperor who supposedly, like Methodius, goes to visit. So there's a real loss of knowledge, or a real loss of interest, whichever way you want, in the Eastern world. This text completely repositions itself, facing westward, and it becomes kind of obsessed with the local politics of papal Frankish relations. And so there's this kind of sort of rereading of what the alphabet is for. And in this text is the first time that we really have the case made that each nation needs a church, and each church therefore needs a language, which is a discourse that's much more common in the kind of early papal missions to the Anglo-Saxons, as I mentioned earlier, than it is in the East. Although in the East a lot of churches have languages, a lot of churches also share languages, and there's no essentialism there. Whereas actually it seems to be a kind of a very Latinized discourse to think that the Anglo-Saxon church needs it's a kind of Anglo-Saxon clergy, and it needs its kind of, that its peopledom is kind of defined by that.
And yeah, the Slavs are treated as a nation, as a gens, or a people, right? And
exactly, yeah. And that's so papal, right? Because it's the papacy that goes, okay, well, I shall be the church that stands above all people. Whereas in Byzantium, you have a kind of a political body, in the face of the Byzantine Empire, that has to accommodate the fact that there's Armenians, that there's whatever, and there's whatever. Whereas the papacy can remove itself from the gens or the ethnos and be like, well, I'm an institution that hovers above them.
Yeah. So just for the sake of the audience, to back up and sort of ponder some of the significance of some of all this. And so we've been taking a rather sort of textual critical approach to the texts and even to some of the individuals here. None of this is to detract from the importance either of conversion to Christianity, or that it happened, or the invention of the alphabet and all of its consequences and so on. It's just that all of that didn't depend on two people, right? There were a lot of people involved in this process, and we're not even sure that we know the main players necessarily. We have these two texts that identify two individuals and promote them for reasons that have to do with the circles in which the authors are working, which doesn't necessarily get us to what was going on the ground, in Bulgaria or Moravia or wherever. Lots of people were involved in this process. And I think it was a much bigger thing than what we can glimpse through these texts. which are, concerned about the politics of memory of this person, or the, papal involvement in Eastern Europe and all of this. That's all very much, of that moment. The long course of, the way Christian Slavic culture developed was in the hands of thousands of people locally, and, largely out of our sight.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that what you're kind of identifying is a separation between two very different subjects of study that I think, in the case of Slavonic, have kind of accidentally become one. And that's the mythic origins of writing, which is a history of memory, a history of how we remember moments of invention in history. And if you look at the longue durée history of the invention of writing, I mean, back to like Mesopotamia, when supposedly the first ever writing is invented, the story is always that one man against all odds. Like, it's very Hollywood blockbuster.
Yes.
And that's how memory works, right?
Yes,
that's what we do as a species to kind of to make events matter. We reduce them to really simple, often individual act of invention, or likewise a foundation, how a people was founded, how a state was founded. Romulus, the one, whatever. Whereas on the other hand, there's what you very aptly described as the actual history of adoption of social and culturally embedded technological tools, which has to happen at a slow pace across like thousands of people. I mean, there's who invented the automobile, and then there's the fact that everybody now has a car, and those two things are very different. And the spread of driving isn't reducible to that one person. Multiple other actors had to make certain decisions to choose this thing. And I think the thing that is particularly problematic in collapsing these two, as the Slavonic alphabet scholarship has tended to do, which is to just say, of course, Constantine invented this alphabet, and then the Slavs were so happy that it happened that they all adopted it, and that the end. Is that we omit the kind of realities of social hierarchy and social history, right? Which is the thing that kind of makes history interesting. I mean, the alphabet sort of lived or died on the basis of whether or not political actors with sufficient power and influence chose to promote it or not. But approaching it in this kind of mythical way, doesn't really give us the opportunity to say, well, what if some Slavonic speakers resisted the Slavonic alphabet? That's just not possible in that kind of terminology. Right. Whereas today, there's plenty of Slavonic speakers that resist the Slavonic alphabet, that choose not to use it. So if people are they're not betraying their like ethnos by people in Serbia choose to write an official document in Latin and not in Cyrillic. That seems fine. That doesn't seem like it's a national betrayal. Whereas we don't recognize that having happened in the past. So there's a kind of glaring hole there of what that process was actually like.
Yeah. Do you see in the way that the legend of Constantine and Methodius evolved, especially the way it kind of reached the 20th century, that it has these kinds of aspects of I don't know what to call it, but like a white savior kind of narrative. In other words, that you need you valorize these two individuals so much, but they're not like from your culture, they're from this other culture. And and it's like you need them to step into your history and intervene to do all of these wonderful things that you think define yourself today. And so then now you're stuck in this place where you have to start, if you can, sort of hiding or downsizing their foreignness to try to make them more of your own, right? And it's like, well, yeah, but you can get out of that narrative altogether by reducing their importance, and by stressing the decisions that had to be made locally over the course of long time. Anyway, I just think it's these kinds of narratives of people stepping into other cultures. Oh, here's some civilization for you.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting, but I also think that what you've identified there is a problem that's kind of at the heart of the account of every historical moment of group formation, because the fact is that any actor that brings a thing into being cannot have already been that thing, and so there's always that those actors are always liminal. Like if you read, for example, the story of the invention of writing in Japan, the way that writing begins in Japan is through Chinese traders. So there's always like,
Right.
but very likewise, if you read the beginning of, say, the Bulgars in Central Asia, like their first ruler, he seems to have been himself like of Hunnic origin. So there's always in any kind of Genesis moment, there's the discomfort of the pre-Genesis time.
Exactly. Yes.
And so I think that it's kind of inescapable, really, that there will always be that tension, whatever it is that
yes.
that formulated that Genesis, you know?
It works exactly in the Greek case, you know, with Cadmus, who was a Phoenician.
That's right.
Brought the Phoenician letters. Yes. And then there's all this. I mean, for the most part, the Greeks didn't. Yeah. So, okay. We stole them fair and square. But there is, in some cases, there's some anxiety. And like I said, when you get to the modern narratives, 20th century, there's a lot of anxiety about this. And you have, you know, nationalist scholars who are like adamantly denying that Greek was ever based on like Semitic languages. Ew, that's not going to happen, right? And so you have denial of like Indo-European theory and the history of scripts and all of this stuff because of precisely this liminal. You don't want that foreign figure to be so central to your own narrative.
No, absolutely. And it's I mean, there's an amazing conspiratorial book I found in a secondhand bookshop in Bulgaria, and the title of which is Why Cyril and Methodius Were Really Bulgarian. And it's like, well, actually, they literally never went to the lands of Bulgaria in their whole lives. They were born in Thessaloniki, they went to Constantinople, they went to Pannonia, they went to Rome.
There you go.
Where? But of course, but as you say, it's this kind of, you know, the 19th century nationalist kind of narratives are much neater than the medieval equivalents, because the thing that actually happens with the Cyril and Methodius texts is, you know, one text says Cyril, he's a Byzantine intellectual, there's some Slavs, it's not important, he's really important though. The other text says there's Methodius, and oh my god, the papacy, like, you would love this. And then both of these texts just continue to circulate. Like, no one wins out. We don't know which was the most persuasive. They both just go on. These two completely alternative visions of what the alphabet meant are just reproduced and reproduced and reproduced in various like liturgical manuscripts. That doesn't work. Doesn't cut it in the nation state of homogeneity. Which narrative is the narrative? Which is the right one? And so suddenly these things start being kind of washed away or simplified, and the Phoenicians are removed from the picture. And actually, it turns out that Cadmus was Greek all along.
Yes. Well, I think that's a great place to bring this to a close, and especially with modern conspiracy theories. As you know, once we hang up here, we're going to go off and deal with a whole bunch of conspiracy theories that we're drowning in. So, Mirella, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I had a lot of fun with this.
Thanks for having me. This was great.
And good luck. You know, you're going to work this up into a book, right? It's going to be a longer project, so I look forward to reading that too when it's ready.
Thanks very much, Anthony.
Bye.